Well, I've got another small experiment painting that I did on some Arches cold press paper. This is a 7 by 10 inch transparent watercolor of a winter-plumed Royal Tern. Normally I paint on hot press paper that has a lot less texture than this surface. In this video I'll share my thoughts on what I found to be the strengths and weaknesses of this paper. After transferring my sketch to the paper and frisketing off the bird, I planned on doing the background in 3 main passes: the water, the breaking foamy wave, and the wet sandy shore. Before doing the wash, I flipped my page because generally speaking, if you're doing a gradient wash, you want your darkest colors to be at the bottom of the page when it's tilted. It's best to do this because gravity is going to want to pull all the paints down the page. If things end up getting darker than anticipated, it's always at the bottom of the page. So why fight one of the fundamental laws of nature? I wanted the top part of the page to transition from focused to blurry waves. In order to have that smooth gradient, I pre-wet my paper with water. Once it was evenly saturated, I started washing in my pre-mixed background colors with a 1-inch flat brush. My first color was a mix of cerulean blue and dioxazine violet, followed by a mix of ultramarine blue and dioxazine violet desaturated with a little Indian red. While the page was still evenly wet, I took a number 2 round brush and streaked in some suggestions of waves. Since the page was saturated with paint and water, the waves should have blurry soft edges. I hit that with a hairdryer to lock it in and used liquid frisket to mask off a few foreground rocks and shells. Afterwards, I hit those with the hairdryer. Working on dry paper, I rendered a quick pass on the small foamy waves that were rolling in, and then went about adding some foreground sharper edged waves using the same number 2 round brush. For the shoreline, I first brought in some of my pre-mixed light background blues with a little added phthalo blue as a reflected light. Then I put in some sandy tones using a mix of yellow ochre with a little Indian red and dioxazine violet. Following that, I started glazing in more details, working on the foamy edge of the incoming wave. On the shoreline, I washed in some more yellow ochre desaturated with dioxazine violet. With the basics rendered to the background, I removed the frisket. I can add more details to the background later as needed. I'd like to get the frisket off the paper as soon as possible. I transfer the rest of the foreground sketch using a tracing paper transfer and a folding bone. The highly textured surface of this cold press paper doesn't get as clean of a transfer as hot press papers, but it still works. My first goal at this point in the painting is always to cover most of the white of the page, leaving only my highlight areas. I started the foreground by washing in the shadow side of my bird using the same colors that I pre-mixed. That should help unify the overall palette down the road. Next, I started washing in my warm colors, starting with that crazy bright beak. That's always one of the first things I notice when I look at these Royal Terns. Once that was in, I switched to a number 6 round brush and used some of those same yellow oranges, only watered down to wash in warm highlights where the evening sun was hitting the bird. When selecting a background color for the waves, I specifically chose a purple gray. That should be a good color opposite to the orange-yellow beak and those sunlit feathers, making those areas really pop. Next came a layer of fairly neutral gray to the wings and tail. That was made with Indian red and ultramarine blue. A darker version of those same colors was used to paint in the first pass of color to the legs and their reflection. At this point, most of the base colors were all in, and it was a matter of putting in many glazes of paint to build my textures and details. After putting a few details on the shore, I switched back to the bird, adding another pass of shadows. Then I worked on the head feathers and added some serious darks on the tail. More glazing went in on the beak with cadmium red medium, and additional warmths were brought into the bird's back with lemon yellow mixed with chrome orange. I pushed the shoreline warmer with some yellow ochre. The legs got oranges added to the sunlit side before more darks were added into the tail and the legs. It was at about this point in the painting that I really started getting frustrated with the paper. I try hard not to be an overly negative person, so I'm going to strive to be positive here. This Arches cold press paper does take a wash beautifully and predictably. That's awesome. When it comes to really glazing in a lot of detail, that's where this paper starts to fail. Well, at least for me. I think that's a three-part problem. First, this paper is really bumpy, almost of rough texture. Some other brands' cold press paper, like Kilimanjaro, is just as good at washing, but isn't nearly as rough. I didn't have issues with the bumps getting in the way of the detail with the Kilimanjaro paper. I was considering switching over to that brand before it was discontinued. Now, if you like working on a bumpy surface, then the Arches cold press paper may be perfect for you. I can't even imagine how coarse Arches rough watercolor paper must be. I know that isn't a surface I'd like to work on. The second problem is that I'm really working in a small format here with a 7 by 10 inch paper, so those bumps are kind of amplified. On an 11 by 14 or an 18 by 24 inch page, they may not be as noticeable and problematic. The third problem is that I've spent the majority of the last 25 years almost exclusively working on Arches 140-pound hot press paper. And its smooth, flat surface is definitely fussy about taking a wash, and it requires precise technique to get smooth results. But it's ideal for doing detailed watercolors, even in small formats like 5 by 7 inches. Don't get me wrong, I think this cold press paper is a good quality surface to work on, just not engineered to do the highly detailed work. It's kind of like asking a Clydesdale to run the Kentucky Derby or a thoroughbred to plow your field. Technically, they might both get the jobs done, but neither's designed to do the other task. I guess that's why they make different papers. So after these experiments, I think I'm done trying to do detailed work on this Arches cold press paper. I'll save it for some ink wash paintings or other loose projects where it should shine. And I'll revert back to my Arches 140-pound hot press paper for the detailed work. At this point, I was basically glazing in light layers of paint, sneaking up on my final colors in many passes. Typically, that builds the textured look of the feathers as those layers of paint overlap. That's less easy to do on this bumpy cold press paper. Generally, I find it best to move around the page a lot rather than painting one section until it was completed. Instead, I'll render the beak for a while, and then the heads, the legs, or the wings until everything's at about the same level of detail, and then move on. That keeps things from getting boring, and in the end, the painting receives equal attention across the entire canvas. The spiky crest on the back of the tern's head was one area where the paper's bumps really made things hard. On hot press paper, that would have gone in pretty quickly and easily. The bird's wing was kind of fun in that it was a light gray, but it moved between shadow tones and sunlit areas. I found myself glazing in many layers of yellows and oranges to the highlight areas and purples and blues to the shadows to get things more dimensional. Again, the rough paper made a lot of detail work problematic, so I was going to have to rely on suggesting more and rendering less. I switched over to my 10-aught brush to add a lot of tiny dark details to the beak, head, and neck. Those 10-aught brushes are nice for detail, but they don't hold much pigment. I switched back to a number 2 round brush to bring in a lot of finer dark shadows to the edges of the wing's feathers. I continued using that brush to pick away at the water's edge. I signed the painting and then put it away overnight. It's always a good idea to take a bit of time away from a painting when you think you're finished. When you come back and look at it, you always find a dozen or so more tweaks that need to be made before it's really finished. I definitely had a bunch of things to tune up before calling it quits. I think this was my last attempt at doing a detailed watercolor on this cold press paper. In the end, I felt like I was fighting with it to get the job done. This paper shines when you're doing looser work, not trying to force it into tight, highly rendered results. I still have 17 sheets left to use. I think I'm going to save it for some looser ink wash projects where it should work great. So in the end, I thought this finished experiment was adequate, but not up to my usual painting standards on hot press paper. Oh well, you don't always know until you try. And although I found the surface frustrating to work on, I think it's always good to attempt something different. Typically, that's when you're learning the most. Well, thanks for taking the time to watch this painting experiment take shape. I hope you all get the chance to paint soon.